So good morning, dear colleagues, good afternoon, good evening, depending from which part of the world you are joining us today. My name is Ksenia Kizilova. I'm chair of the liaison committee at WAPOR, and I'm very happy today to welcome you at the next webinar organized by the World Association for Public Opinion Research. Our today's webinar is a special event. Many of you have surely already participated in the webinars WAPOR held earlier this year. But our today's webinar signifies a new series of webinars. These are panel discussions which we will be holding jointly with the leading public opinion research centers, with international survey research organizations, and large-scale comparative survey research projects. The partner of our today's webinar is the Global Barometer survey. This is a cross-national public opinion research effort which is dedicated to the study of political culture, political values, political attitudes of citizens around the globe. The Global Barometer survey covers 6 world regions, represented by 6 regional barometers. By now, there are around 100 participating countries, and this survey represents the opinion of about 75% of the world's population. The structure of GBS, as I said, is represented by 6 regional barometers, and today we have a distinct pleasure to hear from the leaders of all 6 barometers and learn about the most recent developments in terms of public opinion research and how those have been affected by the challenging times of pandemic which we are living now in. Before we proceed further, I would like to make a brief technical remark. We will have first 6 presentations by our 6 panelists, and after this, we'll have some time reserved for the questions and answer session. Given that our webinar is limited in time, I invite all our participants today not to wait till the very end of the event, but please share your feedback, your questions, and your comments with us anytime during the webinar using the chat function. In the bottom of your screen in Zoom, you can see that there is a Q&A and chat function, and we ask you please to use chat for your questions and comments. Having said that, I would like also to give a word now to my colleague and the co-moderator of our today's webinar, Professor Yunhan Chu. Professor Yunhan Chu will introduce the topic we will be discussing today. Yunhan is a distinguished research fellow of the Institute of Political Science at Academia Sinica and professor of political science at National Taiwan University. Yunhan serves as the president of the Chan Chin-Ku Foundation for International Scholarly Exchange. Yunhan specializes in politics of Greater China, East Asian political economy, and democratization. Yunhan is the director of the Global Barometer survey and also the one of the 6 regional barometers, the Asian Barometer survey. Please, Yunhan, the floor is yours now for your opening remark.
Thank you, Ksenia. This is Yunhan Chu. Good morning or good evening, everyone. It's my truly an honor and pleasure to co-moderate this very important and timely webinar. Speaking on behalf of the Global Barometer Survey, I welcome you all to this it's going to be a very interesting intellectual deliberation. The Global Barometer Survey is a federation of 6 regional barometer survey. To be specific, actually, I serve as a co-chair of the Executive Council of the GBS, along with Marta Lago. She's also present today. We forged this partnership more than 15 years ago. Nowadays, the GBAs cover more than 95 countries, virtually the entire developing world. And by any measure, this is one of the most significant and most comprehensive large-scale public opinion survey network in social science community. And sometimes we boast that we give voice to more than 2/3 of the world population. I think today's topic is hugely important. Obviously, COVID-19 pandemic posed a huge challenge to survey researchers, especially to GBS, in so many different ways. At least, it poses number one, some practical challenge to survey researcher. In the past, we always rely on face-to-face interview. And this become almost impossible in some society during the Great Lockdown. So either some of the projects have to be postponed, or we have to find an alternative way of collecting data from individual respondents in a very innovative and also flexible manner. So I think today that we will learn from our colleagues from different parts of the world to share their experience, how their own regional Barometer survey has managed to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic. But not only our survey project, have to confront this unexpected obstacle, but also I think this global crisis actually give us, an historically opportunity to re-examine our ongoing risk agenda and to think very seriously and carefully that how we can be really very useful and to be relevant in this global response to this very, very lethal and devastating public health crisis. Well, the COVID-19 probably won't alter the course of history, but nevertheless, it necessarily will accelerate many of the ongoing trends. And also this crisis apparently have exposed all the underlying problem and deficiency of the existing political institution and social economic model. Although, we recognize that society do not always respond to this crisis equally effective. Some countries are able to flatten the curve within a very short time span. Other society are still struggling, with the escalating number of affected victims and also people who are very unfortunate pass away due to this serious affection. So we have to think very seriously and more deeply, what account for this cross-regional and cross-national diversity, and what really matter, whether that has something to do with quality of leadership or the public trust in public authority, especially in government, and whether it has a lot to do with the capacity of the state. I think all above, they are obviously relevant factor that we should take into account in making sense of the severity of this global crisis. But at the same time, I think it's very important that how we might use our empirical research methodology to objectively and systematically assess the impact of this pandemic, especially from a bottom-up, from the grassroots perspective. Obviously, it has cast so many, the adverse impact across entire population in every affected society. We are talking about psychological, social, and economic, and so on and so forth. And in some country, the incumbent, might even be penalized, for not being able to respond to this crisis in a timely and effective way. So I think, this is a golden opportunity for some researchers to look into these important issues. Also, finally, I think, people will be curious, whether this crisis will sharpen all the ongoing conflict and cleavage even before the pandemic crisis, we see the clash between people who embrace globalization versus people who become more nationalistic and become more protectionistic and also become highly critical of the economic opening. And even before this public health crisis, I witnessed that there's so many emerging criticism against the new liberal ideology and prescription. And this time, my friend Francis Fukuyama just a few months ago declared that new liberalism is dead this time, because from his point of view that people finally recognize the importance of competent and strong state, especially during this crisis. So I think these kind of debate and controversy will be on the table and become really the kind of public issue debate that will prevail for many years to come. So without further ado, I think we are very lucky and fortunate to have 6 outstanding speakers. They will give their presentation by turn. And so now I will want to hand over the podium back to my co-moderator, Xenia. Xenia, please. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Yunhan. Thank you for this brilliant introduction into the topic of our today's discussion. We really look forward to hearing from our 6 panelists, and I'm delighted to give the floor now to our first presenter. Minhua Huang is the co-principal investigator of Asian Barometer and professor at the Department of Political Science at National Taiwan University. Minhua is also director of the Center for East Asia Democratic Studies in the College of Social Sciences, National Taiwan University. Minhua is conducting research on Asian politics, and he is also a leading specialist on multivariate statistical analysis. Please, Minhua, the floor is yours.
Good day, everyone. It's my honor here to, on behalf of Asian Barometer, to join this webinar. Today I'm going to talk about Singaporean because Asian Barometer right now is in the wave 5. We have already conducted most of our countries in 2018 and 19. Only 3 countries left, and Singapore is the only one during the pandemic periods we now have already finished. So I'm going to give you a little bit of sense about how, for example, like Singapore, when they're going through the pandemic, the change and unchange of their public perception under the COVID pandemics. Okay, so basically Singapore, how should I put it? It's not really that serious in terms of total numbers. Right now it's about 58,000 until 3 days ago. But in terms of case per million, it's quite high because Singapore is very small, have a very, the density of population is really high. So if you actually divide it by the total case by the total populations, actually is a rank in the front among all the Asian countries. So relatively speaking, Singapore is kind of serious in terms of per million per case per million. This is Asian Barometer's the survey schedule. You can look at the table at the rightist columns. Right now, we still have 2 ongoing, Hong Kong and also Cambodia just kick off. And Singapore, we have already finished in September, so which only 2 months ago. So it's in the pandemic, very serious periods we do the survey. But relatively speaking, it's still more moderate in terms of US or Europe standards. Okay, so this gives you a case about a longitudinal, the trend line. So actually, Singapore is much more serious between March and July and June. And after that is kind of steady. So the timing we are doing survey actually is doing their steady periods. Okay, so I'm going to talk about economic impact. this graph actually telling you about Singaporean economic growth rate when we do the survey in wave 3, wave 4, and wave 5. I'm going to give you a comparison of wave 5 comparing to wave 4 and wave 3 and to see is there any changing. And in wave 3, in wave 4, actually wave 3 is coming through kind of economic growth plummet since 2007 is a financial crisis, but a bounce back and a surge very quickly in 2010. And in wave 4, relatively, they are in a much steady state, is about 4.84%. But in 2019 and 2020, relatively speaking, economic growth, even in 2019, is actually down to 0.7. And 2020, according to the previous 2-quarter estimation, will be negative 6.9. So relatively speaking, they are right now in a much worse in terms of economic growth rate. But I would say probably in every country in the world will experience similar cases. And then we look at this. This actually, we're asking about the respondent to rate overall economic conditions. Actually look at this. In wave 5, if you read look at the red bar is actually climbing very significantly to almost 30%. And if you look at the blue bar, actually down in half comparing to 2014. So actually, economic-wise, they all recognize the Singapore with the economic condition is not good. This is about what do you think will be the state of our country economic condition a few years from now? The expectations here. The expectation also dropping. But not that serious as the current economic situation. You see the blue bar is from like upper 50s down to the lower 40. And if you actually look at the red bar is climbing up to mid 30s. Originally only had teens. And as to their own family, this is rating the economic situation of their own family. And in terms of when they using their own family as a reference point, again, the economic situation is bad as well, but not as serious. So which means that they have some allowances they can handle with the, although it's pessimistic, but they can handle it. And here is about the a few years from now in terms of economic situation, reference point, also the family. Here also you can see the blue bar actually not that dropped that significant, only like 3 points from 2010 and probably around 20 points from 2014. But if you look at the red bar is rising a little bit. But again, is when you refer to family situation, I think they can get by much better than when they evaluate the overall economic situation for the country. So we can look at the political impact as well. And the battery here, I'm going to present mostly about the trusts. And Singapore just coming through elections in this summer, and actually the PAP won, won another election, but the opposition actually grows also significantly. So there's a lot of political mobilization going on in this summer in Singapore. So this is Prime Minister in terms of the trusts. You don't see much changes from the 2010-2014. It's pretty steady. In terms of national government, Singaporean government, again, it's pretty steady. And even 68 is a little bit higher than 78 comparing to the previous wave in 2014. If we look at the parliament, again, the similar pattern showing up. So in terms of political trusts and civil service, even grow significantly higher, approaching 90%. And the distrust rate down to less than 10%. What this tells us is under the emergent pandemic periods, the political trust in Singapore is not going down, but instead actually it either maintain the status quo or even climb a little bit, especially for the civil service actually doing things. And how does it play out in terms of cultural impact? So what I'm looking at is collectivism. Suppose should be very stronger, right? Because we need sacrifice a lot of individual freedom in terms of control pandemics. And here you see, for the sake of family, individuals should put his personal interest second. This battery is pretty steady, not much changes comparing to the previous two waves. In a group, we should sacrifice our individual interests for the sake of group collective interest. Similarly, also steady. But if we look at this, national interest, so it's queuing about specifically about individual interests and national interests. So you can see a little bit more significant increase, so up to 72%, and the disagree down to 25%. So I think the culture is the same, collectivism is strong, but when the queuing, I mean the words, you're using the right words, it was showing even stronger collectivism. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two possible trends here. The first thing is I think economic pessimism is still, will last for a while. So this question is about how worried are you that your family might lose its major source of income within 12 months. So you can see the blue bar actually come up around 9%, and the red bar down to around 7%, right? So a little bit more pessimistic economic-wise. So this is the last question I'm going to present. If your family were unfortunate enough to lose its main source of income, how serious would it be for your family? For this one, the changes is not as significant, which means that Singaporean family usually has a much more allowance and preparation for them to, to actually get past for a very, very significant, pessimistic period of time, unfortunate period of time. So, which means they are quite good. This is the characteristic of the East Asia household and family. All right. So the last one I'm going to talk about is a lot of, is in pandemics, the government will doing a lot of, the measures that in the normal time they wouldn't do, and the people in normal time wouldn't maybe agree. Right, so this kind of things we call in some countries much more serious. Is their country trying to use this opportunity in terms of pandemic, trying to expand their administrative prerogative, and in some ways they're doing really unfavorable composition toward opposition. So there's a trend toward authoritarianism even in democratic institutions. Okay, so I'm going to give you a conclusion. I think pandemic provide opportunity for leaders to secure solid support, but it's difficult to combine environmental multi-party competition. I think it provides opportunity for competitive authoritarianism because the ruling party usually trying to take advantage of this opportunity to consolidate their power and to make the competition even lopsided. So I think once the competitive authoritarian is in place, or democracy may have trouble. Okay, so I'm stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minhua. The case of Singapore is truly fascinating, and I'm sure we will have a very interesting discussion about it at the end of our webinar. And I'm delighted now to give a word to our second speaker today, to Professor Sandeep Shastri. Sandeep is the coordinator of South Asia Barometer and Pro-Vice Chancellor at Jain University in Bangalore in India. Sandeep is director of the Center for Research in Social Sciences and Education at Jain University. He is the national coordinator of the Locknity Network, and also he serves as the principal investigator for India at the World Values Survey. The research of Sandeep is focused on election studies, issues of federalism, and innovation in teaching. Sandeep, please, the floor is yours. You have to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much, Sinia, for the opportunity. And it's a delight to represent the South Asia Barometer, and greetings to everybody from the South Asia region. I would speak about the response of South Asia to the pandemic, and in keeping with the brief I had, I would be doing two things. One, how has our survey research undergone a change due to the pandemic? And what does our data say with regard to the citizens' attitude vis-a-vis the pandemic? I thought I would share to start with the two photographs that I have put here, because these two photographs in some senses represent the reality of South Asia. You have a farmer in South Asia taking part in an interview conducted by us with all the precautions. And on the right, you have a homemaker giving an interview, again linked to one of our studies. So I thought these two pictures, one in an urban locale of a woman giving an interview, and one in a rural locale of in the middle of the fields, a person, a farmer giving his interview, in a sense symbolizes what you would see in South Asia. To take this discussion forward, I will, of course, very clearly be focusing on South Asia, and the South Asia Barometer covers 5 countries, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, and issues relating to these countries is what I would discuss. And I think it's important for us to speak about South Asian socioeconomic realities first. And I think if I were to put it a little cynically, a lot of South Asia believes nothing much has changed because we are used to moving from one crisis to another crisis. And as nations and societies, we are used to dealing with crisis. So many in South Asia would say that this is one more crisis that we are dealing with. It's only that with that crisis being felt for a longer period of time, people realize that it's not just something which we are normally dealing with, but there is something very special about it. I must say that as part of the South Asia Barometer, we have not done any studies during the pandemic. We had completed the India round of the South Asia Barometer study last year. We were scheduled to do Bangladesh and Sri Lanka during this year, but the pandemic has forced us to postpone it to the early part of next year. And we are also looking at Nepal and Pakistan in the next year. So what I'm going to focus on is 3 important studies that we as a group, the group which does the South Asia Barometer, the Lokniti CSDS group, the 3 important studies that we did during the pandemic and certain changes that we made in our strategies for doing surveys is what I would talk about, and also reflect on what I would call the wider implications of what do citizens say with regard to governance during the pandemic. So these are the 2 broad areas which I thought I would focus on as part of my presentation. I've already mentioned this, that the preparation for the conduct of the South Asia Barometer in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh is on. All the preliminary tasks have been completed, and we are hoping that in the early part of next year, the survey would happen in these 2 regions. And later in Nepal and Pakistan, India has already been completed. I'm also happy to report that the conduct of the World Values Survey in India is also reaching a stage of going into the field. The pre-survey tasks have been completed, and we are hoping to do this sometime in the early part of next year. But what are the 3 studies I'm talking of which we have already done? During the pandemic, we did a study called the Rural Connect Survey. We did a survey across rural India, a representative sample across rural India, to look at what was the popular perception of how the government handled the pandemic. So I would talk about that in a moment. Secondly, one of the major states of India, the state of Bihar, went to a poll earlier this month. And the Lokniti CSDS did a pre-poll and a post-poll survey and this election happened during the pandemic. So it gives us very important insights on public perceptions of governance as seen in these 2 surveys. And finally, we are in the process, and in some states it's still going on, the 3rd round of what in India we do, the police survey. We have already done 2 rounds of citizen attitude towards the police and the police's own attitude towards the work that they do. We have already done 2 rounds of that, and that's been published and has become a focus of a lot of discussion. And now we are moving into the 3rd round of that. That is currently going on. So I'm now going to straight go into the 2 areas I said I would talk about. What changes have we brought about in our survey techniques consequent to the pandemic, and what is public response to the government's handling of the pandemic? They often say that a picture is more important than 100 words. So I am sharing these 7 pictures with you, which give you an example of the diversity of surveys under a pandemic and the safety measures we are all taking in order to do the pandemic. I'll start with the photograph which is at the center on the top, which is a photograph of a training workshop which we did before the start of a survey. You move to the right side, you see in a rural area of India, a survey being conducted by one of our surveyors with a young woman. Below that, you will see a security guard being one of our respondents and giving his response to one of our surveyors. If you come to the middle now, you will see in a rural part of Kerala, in a home, the surveyor is sitting with the respondent and getting the responses. If you see bottom left, you see the cow being the photo bomber in a sense and coming in at the middle, and a farmer sitting on his cot giving his interview to a respondent, and above that, a woman in an urban area inviting our respondent into their home and doing a survey there. And the first photo on the left corner is of a cobbler on the street who happened to be our respondent giving a interview to one of our respondents. So I thought I would share this diversity just to show how during the pandemic our surveyors are taking adequate precautions to protect themselves as also to protect the ones that they are doing the survey with. Here are two full photographs of our police survey where police personnel were interviewed as part of our survey. But I would now make 6 important points which I would like to highlight as to 6 dimensions of our survey under a pandemic which have made us change the way we do our surveys. And I believe these 6 changes signify in important ways changes which may continue even after the pandemic is over. Firstly, we have developed a customized mobile app now on which our field investigators do their, conduct the surveys. We still do face-to-face surveys. We have not gone in for mobile surveys because we believe we would not get a representative sample. But rather than doing a pen and paper survey using a questionnaire, a printed questionnaire, now all our field investigators use a mobile app, and the app is customized to the needs of our survey and has been doing extremely well. And it can be used even on a low-end smartphone. Therefore, it's something that has been very effective. We have been able to leverage the benefits of technology. I think we have found that using the mobile app, the quality of our surveys have improved. Our capacity to hold our surveyors accountable has increased. We are able to upload data much faster, and we are able to bring in minor changes if we feel it is necessary as we see the responses coming from the ground. Thirdly, I would say we have continued to emphasize training, but we have gone in for online training, which has been equally effective. We had to train our field investigators in order to use the mobile app, and they were quite successful in doing that. For the latest police survey round, we have also gone back to face-to-face training with all the precautions which that training would require. A fourth and very important element which the pandemic brought in was we have decentralized our whole survey process. We earlier had state coordinators who looked after our survey. We continue to have our state coordinators who are central to our project. But now we also have people supporting the state coordinators in every district, and various decisions which need to be taken for the survey during the pandemic is done at that level. And this allows much, much, much better monitoring of the quality of the field work we find. We also have brought in some flexibility without compromising on quality. One of the USPs of the Lokniti CSDS survey has been we use the voters list to be able to draw the respondents, and we have found for the last 25 years, this has been the most robust of methods. For one survey, we did not use that, but we also still made sure that our sample was representative. We allowed for some substitution, and we have found that the quality of our data has improved significantly. I have a minute more, so in that minute, I'm going to talk about two small things here. In our surveys, we asked people how badly were they affected by the pandemic. More than 44% said our life came to a virtual standstill, and 1/3 said our life was largely affected. So close to 8 out of 10 people said that there was a serious crisis we faced in the pandemic. Close to 3/4 said that it was difficult to fulfill our basic needs during the pandemic. And now I come to my last 2 points of data I wanted to use. What did you think of the pandemic measures that the government used? 40% said it was very harsh, and 38% said it was adequately harsh. But then I now draw your attention to what is coming on the right side. The satisfaction with the different levels of government. We have both the state government and the federal government, and you will notice that if you add somewhat satisfied and very satisfied, it comes to close to 3/4 of the respondents. So though people felt that the measures were harsh, they also felt that this was necessary at this particular point of time, which comes to my closing comments, for which I'll take just half a minute. I think the learnings from the pandemic for us in terms of survey research is to improve the quality of our work, to adjust to the realities of the pandemic and still do what we are doing. We have been able to tap citizen response very effectively. How the citizens believe that the government is making its best efforts, and this is reflected in the type of electoral outcomes that we saw in Bihar. We are leveraging technology very effectively. And finally, I would say, I think in South Asia, what has stood out for the success of South Asia, not just in this pandemic, but generally, is the spirit of resilience that you see in the people of this region. I would stop there and be very happy to respond to questions. And I apologize to Yunhan and Sneha for taking maybe a minute more than what was allotted to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandeep. This has been really very fascinating to learn about the experience and all those innovations in public opinion research that have been introduced by your Public Opinion Research Center. And we will now move from India to Sub-Saharan Africa. And I am delighted to introduce our next speaker, Boniface Dulani, who is the Director of Surveys at Afrobarometer. Boniface is a senior lecturer and project research coordinator at the University of Malawi. He is senior partner at the Institute of Public Opinion Research in Malawi and member of many professional bodies and associations, including the American Political Science Association, the African Studies Association, and the Malawi Political Science Association. Boniface, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you can all see, and I'm also hoping that my
Have we lost Boniface for a moment?
Yes, Boniface, are you with us?
My connection with God. I will share on the African colleagues from Southeast Asia. We also have not been able to experiences of COVID-19 on the African continent and how that has research on the continent. And then
So I'm afraid Boniface has experienced difficulties in connection. I think for now we will need to move to our next speaker. Christian, will you be able to step in while we are waiting for Boniface to improve his connection?
yes, of course.
So I'm delighted now to introduce our next speaker, Professor Dr. Christian Herpfer. He's the director of Eurasia Barometer and professor of sociology in the Department of Government and Society in the College for Humanities and Social Sciences at the United Arab Emirates University in Al Ain. Christian is also a research professor of political science at the University of Vienna. He is also the president of the World Values Survey Association and the national representative of WAPOR for Austria. Christian will speak about the experience of Eurasian Barometer and Eurasian countries. And we will check with Boniface when he will be able to get back to us. Maybe some problems with connection. Please, Christian, we are all ears.
Thank you. I hope the phone is also working, or the microphone. I'm talking today about public opinion, the pandemic, and governance in Europe and Asia. And I would like to start about the impact of the pandemic on governance. So what we noticed in Eurasia is that the movement between countries, between Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, Belarus, and so on, was restricted because different regional governments and national governments tried to reduce the interaction. So what we found out is that the movement between Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Moldova, etc., was reduced, and this was one of the biggest impacts in the region. Also, we noticed that the freedom of association was reduced. Many parliaments have not been able to meet physically. Party members have not been able to meet physically. Party supporters could not meet. But also NGOs and civil society had no chance to meet in person. Another effect of the pandemic on governments and political behavior in our region was that public demonstrations and protests were restricted. We had still protests in Belarus and other countries, but in most countries it was not possible to have public events. Electoral campaigns were restricted. The candidates could not speak publicly at election rallies. The election campaigns have been very much digitalized, and we had a big increase of postal voting in all these countries. And digital participation and social media were replacing conventional and unconventional behavior during this period. So what we have now, after 8 months of Corona, we have a strengthening of governments, a weakening of parliaments. So the role of governments became stronger, support for governments was stable, and sometimes increased. The role of parliaments have been weakened. Parliaments have been used only to rubber stamp decisions because they could not meet face-to-face almost in all these countries. So the long-term effect on governance in Eurasia of this pandemic depends how long it will last into the next year. As a general rule, we can say that the shorter the pandemic will last, the smaller will be the long-term consequences. So it all depends how quick this crisis will terminate. If the pandemic lasts longer into the next year, the bigger will be the long-term inertia of consequences. At the moment, we have a huge restriction of freedom of movement within all these countries. It's very hard to travel at all. So the sooner a global vaccination campaign might be implemented, the sooner we can go back to status quo ante with some modifications. In Afrobarometer, we have the following situation about the survey methodology. In Armenia, our partner is Dr. Pogosyan from the Institute for Sociology at the Academy of Sciences in Yerevan. They are saying at the moment face-to-face interviews in Armenia are not possible. At the moment, surveys are done, but only either as telephone interviews or as online surveys. In Belarus, our principal investigator is Professor Rotman from Belarus State University in Minsk. They told me that we have no face-to-face interviews since the beginning of the year, and there will be no face-to-face interviews until March of next year. At the moment, we have only telephone interviews and online surveys in Belarus. The only country which is doing face-to-face interviews in the Eurasia is in Georgia. Dr. Barchulia from Gorby in Tbilisi, he told us that between March and August, face-to-face interviews have not been possible. But since September of this year, so since 3 months, face-to-face interviews are done. We have a special health training of all interviewers in Georgia. They have to wear face masks, they have to wear gloves, they have to disinfect. And sometimes they move the interview situation, if it's possible in Georgia, from indoors to outdoors. So they try to meet the respondent in a garden outside the building, to sit next to each other in a 2-meter distance and do the face-to-face interview outside the buildings. So this was one solution. Another solution in Georgia was that they go on a Zoom meeting. The interviewer stands outside of the apartment, of the building. The respondent is behind the door, but you can see him behind some window or some balcony, and you do it using the computer, but with a face-to-face contact. So Georgia is, in this respect, the only country where we can do, at the moment, face-to-face interviews. In Kazakhstan, our PI is Dr. Gulsam Alimbekova from Tsiom in Almaty. In Kazakhstan, at the moment, there is no face-to-face interview possible. The surveys are done only in 2 modes, telephone or online. In Moldova, it's a similar situation. Our partner there is Dr. Olga Dani from Opinia in Chisinau, and they are doing at the moment all the CATI, computer-assisted telephone interviews using telephones. They don't use online because the online saturation in Moldova is not good enough to have a representative online survey. In Russia, our partners are Moscow State University, Dr. Alexander Gasparishvili, and they are moving currently completely to online surveys. They did an interview with 40,000 students all over the federation because students have sometimes better access to online services compared to other citizens in Russia. What about the plans of Eurasia Barometer? At the moment, we have a scenario of 3 options. Our network is saying that we could consider CAPI, computer-assisted paper interviewing, either in spring next year, May to June, which would be option number 1, or in autumn, September, October next year, option number 2. So our colleagues assume that the best situation would be in September, because then we have still about almost 12 months to prepare it. If the situation gets better earlier, we can do it in spring. If the situation is deteriorating in Eurasia, we are planning to have a combined telephone CATI survey and online survey in spring next year, between February and April. So that's the situation in Eurasia. So all is in flux, and we're happy to answer any questions from your side. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian. It's been really interesting to see what solutions our partners in Eurasia have found to cope with the limitations caused by the pandemic and the quarantines and lockdowns. We have now back with us Boniface Dulani from Afrobarometer. And Boniface, you can now start your presentation. I'm sharing it.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. And again, my apologies for the connection issues. As I was saying, that like our colleagues, we in Afrobarometer have also been impacted by the COVID-19 situation. If you could move to the next slide, I'm just restarting. So the Afrobarometer, we do our surveys in rounds. At the moment, we are in the 8th cycle of surveys. This started in 2019, but in early 2020, we had to suspend all fieldwork activities. Our target was to do a total of 36 country surveys under the current cycle, but when the COVID-19 situation came in, we had only done half of our surveys. Right. An overview, a brief overview, how we as Afrobarometer have adapted and adjusted from that. And I will also share towards the end just some of the key highlights of the health situation conducted prior to the onset of the pandemic. So generally speaking, in terms of the COVID-19 situation on the continent, we had the first cases in February, in early February of this year, and since then the pandemic has spread across the entire continent, with the latest figures showing just slightly over 2 million cases and about 48,600 deaths, which represents just about 3.6% of the total number of deaths across the continent. The latest numbers also show that there have been 1.7 million recoveries, and that when you look at the total number of cases, 3 countries really make up about half of the total number of cases, and these are South Africa, Egypt, and Ethiopia. Other countries that have been worse affected include Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, Algeria, Libya, and a few others. But generally speaking, compared to other global regions, the COVID-19 burden on the African continent has been relatively low. So as I already pointed out, if you could move to the next slide, please. Yeah. So as I already pointed out, we did start our eighth round of forced to stop. We're forced to stop. Halfway through the surveys because of the COVID-19 situation. Of course, the initial fears with them on the continent was that Africa would be overwhelmed by the pandemic, and this might also explain why very quick to introduce measures to prevent the pandemic, including imposition of lockdowns, curfews, schools being closed, and so on and so forth. In some cases, these measures were introduced of COVID-19. For example, Lesotho and Malawi in Southern Africa, closed schools and imposed other measures even before they had registered any new COVID cases. Overall, I think there's a general sense that the responses have had a positive effect, especially when you look at the caseload on the continent. Of course, some people attribute the low number of cases to, younger population on the continent, favorable climate and weather, as well as good community health systems that have really helped for people to, at the local level, to take action on the pandemic before the number of cases have risen. So how has Afrobarometer really responded to the pandemic? If we could move to the next slide, please. So like our colleagues in the Eurobarometer, we also suspended fieldwork activities. In March, But we have, unlike our colleagues, at least I know from the Asian side, but like our Asian colleagues, we have since resumed the face-to-face surveys, fieldwork activities last month in a select number of countries. We having satisfied our COVID protocols, and we have felt comfortable enough to resume fieldwork activities. But in the period between the suspension of fieldwork activity, we've undertaken several initiatives, that have also enabled us to learn a bit more about our methodologies and what we can do when faced with another pandemic like this in the future. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Time when fieldwork activities were suspended in March, we had 2 countries that were already in the field at that moment, and these include Sierra Leone and Mali. But after the suspension, really, we took the opportunity to develop very detailed and exhaustive fieldwork resumption protocols for us to guide us in the resumption of fieldwork activities, decide which countries to allow to resume fieldwork and which ones we have said we will still really postpone fieldwork activities. We've also used the opportunity to develop remote technical assistance. The way Afrobarometer works is that we have national partner organizations in the 36 countries where we operate. They do have different technical capacities. Some of them are able to run surveys on their own, while others require the presence of our technical fieldwork staff to provide assistance. So in the process, then in the period when we've had protocols for us to provide the resumption of fieldwork activity. Have since resumed the fieldwork activities, the first surveys in Liberia, Nigeria, and we do have a survey in the field in the Mauritius, and 2 more are planned from next week in Zambia and Senegal. But these are countries where we have been satisfied that it is safe to resume fieldwork activities, and all our fieldwork staff are provided with personal protective equipment, and the caseload of COVID-19 is low enough that we feel that we are not putting either the risk. And just to demonstrate how serious we are giving the COVID-19 situation, well as Mozambique, that they should be to make activities, but having assessed them again, they are not ready for the COVID situation. In line then from previous data in terms of how survey pandemics. I think looking at actually before the pandemic, we feel that we can use it to provide measures of living and gaps in meeting basic needs. We can also, when we have used that data really to capture experiences, people, place, and institutions. So the governance aspect, I should also add that it is, we have now developed quite an extensive module getting now more detailed data that we will be analyzing on public reaction. We could just also move to the next slide. I'll just show a few highlights in terms Africa really, this is Davis. What is, about 1/3 of citizens on, sorry, if you could just, about 1/3 of the citizens on the continent experience, say that they require it, which really puts them at really risky, especially of water it remains a challenge. Only the challenges of accessing water and health services, but also sanitation services. Most citizens have sanitation the home, which really again in. And then lastly, I think in the next slide, I just wanted also to highlight some of the challenges. Care is rated as the second most important priority by citizens on the continent, and that they ask government. Over half of the citizens in Africa say that once in the preceding year, just slightly less than half would say that it was
Okay, so I think unfortunately we lost Boniface again. With very interesting presentation. Most unfortunate that the qualities of the connection is so not very good, but all the presentations will be available at the WAPOR website and also the GBS website. So all the attendees will have a chance to look through the presentation, download them and go through them again. I would like now to invite our next speaker. We move now from Africa further to the other hemispheres, to Americas. And I would like to give a floor now to Marta Lagos. Marta Lagos is the founding director of the Latina Barometer. Marta is a member of coordination groups, the executive committee at the World Values Survey, the comparative study of electoral systems, and Marta is also the co-chair of the Global Barometer survey. Marta has done consulting work on polls and electoral processes in more than 25 countries. She also served as a consultant to the UNDP, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and at WAPOR, Marta serves also as the national representative for Chile. Please, Marta, the floor is yours. You can start sharing your screen and your presentation now.
Well, thank you very much. I have no presentation. I will just be talking about well, our region, 18 countries, all Spanish-speaking, has been the region most affected by the pandemic, in as much as 3 of the countries, Brazil, Peru, and Chile, have been at the top of the amount of deaths per million in the world. Peru was at the top for some weeks, and then Chile was at the top, and then now Brazil is at the top. We have had an enormous impact on infection and deaths, mostly because the health systems have not been able to cope with the amount of people that had been affected by the virus. This is maybe not very surprising, because Latin America has a very weak state infrastructure. And that, without trying to go into the details of how the pandemic evolved, it started in March, the peak was in June, July, August, and we are now in a low turn. Everybody's expecting the second wave, as in Europe. But the important thing here is to understand the effect of these devastating impact not only on health, deaths, but also in the economics. There will be 50 million Latin Americans that will go back into poverty by the end of this pandemic. There is a recession in all countries, and countries have not been able to cope with economic fiscal policies in order to try to flatten the effect of the economic crisis. So we have a health crisis, an economic crisis, but on top of that, the pandemic has produced, and I would like to refer to the very interesting presentation from Minhua about the competitive authoritarianism. On top of that, the pandemic has shown, revealed, has broken down the facelifting, has facelifted all the problems that societies had and were not very visible. Several countries in the region are having, on top of the economic and the health crisis, a political crisis. Maybe the most salient one is the one that just happened last week in Peru, where the president was ousted, was kicked out of office by the parliament. This president had been a replacement for the previous president who had been kicked out of office because of corruption. So he was a replacement. He wasn't the elected one. And he was replaced by a person that lasted 5 days in the presidency and was kicked out of office by the people. People went out into the street and forced the president to resign. Peru has now the third president within 8 days, who is going to call an election in the months of June. This is the political crisis produced by a series of events that have to do with corruption, has to do with the weakness of the state, has to do with the fact that Peru was not able to cope at the beginning of the pandemic in the city of Guayaquil, in the city of, in several cities in the countries, people were left dead on the streets. This was the level of disaster that the pandemic brought about at the beginning. Now, this is not the only country that has enormous political difficulties. We have the case of Guatemala, the case of Honduras, and the case of Salvador, where either elected presidents have turned into popular self-nominated authoritarian leaders, like in the case of Salvador, or they have co-opted several institutions of the state, very similar to the description that Minhua was giving from Singapore, a competitive authoritarianism. So we also have the case of Brazil, who has had a complete failure of capacity of responding to the pandemic. And like President Trump, the president of Brazil said that, people have to die and they have to be brave, and there's nothing that he can do about it. So let them die. This was he just lost the municipal election that took place last week, no doubt because of that. But this has been an attitude of Bolsonaro, who has a style very much similar to Trump. And of course, this leads Brazil to being one of the countries in the world that has the most amount of deaths counted by million of inhabitants. And then there's the case of Argentina. Argentina, who had been doing very well at the beginning of the pandemic, has now a second wave, which has completely devastated, especially outside the capital, and people are not being able to get health care and dying because of that. And so in this very turbulent Latin America, where we are experiencing before our eyes how people leave their houses, they can't pay the rent and go out into the field, take a field and try to build some sort of tent in order to be able to live there without water and electricity. This is the level of poverty that is being produced by the pandemic. We have the crisis of governance. Governance produced not by the pandemic, by problems of democratic consolidation that were there before. Latino Barometer had been showing for the last 7 years a decline in support for democracy and an increase in authoritarian attitudes. And this was concreted, was showed, and it produced consequences now that the pandemic is there. I think this is one of the most obvious regions in the world where one can show how the pandemic has produced, I would say, democratic crisis, not because of the pandemic, but because they were there. They were there and they just needed to be produced. You know, the last drop was the pandemic. And all this brings us to the, I would say, for us, the most important consequence of all this is that we are, I think, facing a change, an epochal change. We're facing a change in attitudes of many leaders, intellectuals, writers, artists, towards a different way of looking at development that was installed before this, I would say, three-way crisis: political, economic, and health crisis. Latin America is going to emerge from this crisis where things can get very worse before they get better. That's one thing to say. It's going to emerge a different region. Maybe we will have populist leaders in the meantime, in between. And maybe we will have more people like Bolsonaro. But the demand for democracy, people on the streets demanding the right thing, has been a constant in, I would say, 10, 12 of the 17 countries. This has been the most significant fact that the pandemic has shown. There is a complete difference between the attitude of elites and this authoritarian, or you could call it autocratic democracies like Salvador and like Brazil, and not to say the least about Venezuela and Nicaragua, of course, but being contrasted by these nations, these people who have demanded higher levels of democracy. I think the case in Peru 4 days ago, when the president, who was in office for 5 days, was kicked out of office by the people, producing some deaths in the meantime, is a fantastic example of the demand for democracy in the region. And this leads me to my last comment. And you can see why I couldn't put this in a presentation. It's too much of an event, of the series of events, to try to put it down into one presentation. Is that I have the most fantastic pleasure of communicating to all my colleagues in the rest of the Global Barometer surveys that we have completed 90% of the 2020 wave of the Latino Barometer in a face-to-face surveys in 17 of the 18 countries. We have only postponed Argentina, most probably until January, but the rest of the countries, we saw the window of the lessening of the pandemic in September. We started the survey on the 26th of October. We are now on the 20th of November, exactly 7 days to the finish line of the fieldwork on a face-to-face survey. We have faced many difficulties, many. The survey is fully face-to-face with the national representative samples that are being probabilistic samples, I mean, the right way. But they're being done all by tablets. I mean, it's all electronic. And therefore, I mean, it is a challenge in those places where, you know, you don't have any internet, et cetera, but we have been able to organize that. And of course, there have been delays in many sub-regions and places where we have had to wait for the quarantine to finish in those places. We waited. If a particular country had a particular region in a quarantine, we did the whole country and waited maybe 1 week or 2 weeks for that particular region to finish the quarantine and be able to go into face-to-face surveys. Even in Venezuela, we have been able to draw a sample that was possible to reach. You know, in Venezuela, there is no petrol, there is no electricity, there is no transport. The country is in a complete, it has been for several years. The last year that we did the Venezuela there, it was the same problem. But we have been able to tackle those problems and produce a national representative sample in Venezuela. So we will have during the month of December, the first results of the 17 countries on a face-to-face survey. This will be the first regional barometer produced in a pandemic, inside the pandemic, in the middle of the pandemic. Of course, in this wave of I would say the bottom of the saddle, not the high point of the saddle, in between the first and second wave that everybody is saying that we are forced to get so or the zo. Maybe it comes after the vaccine. We don't know, but. Let me just say that I think the most important thing to look at here is to try to, for us in Latin America, is to try to distinguish which are the negative effects on the development of democratic crisis that had been produced by the pandemic and which were there before. I think it would be very unjust to blame the pandemic for all the crises we are living. 6, 7 countries are having serious political crisis. But other countries like, for example, Bolivia had a very successful presidential election in the month of October and managed to recover its from the crisis that was produced last year in the election that did not take place, that had to be postponed. The same is the case of República Dominicana, which has had also a very successful presidential election, the first one in the pandemic, which produced alternates in power. And this leads me to my last comment, which is the atomization of the party system. It is, and maybe Peru, the most real explanation of what's going on in Peru is the absence of concrete and real political parties. The succession of crises in Peru has produced the vanishing of political parties, and therefore representation is almost impossible without political parties. And what happened in República Dominicana in the election is also a sign of that same phenomena, in the sense of the emerging new political parties and the very, very weak old political parties. So we should be looking in the region at all these phenomena, and we're very happy to be able to have the data from 2020, which will have an enormous amount of attention because of this possibility of having it done just in the few weeks of windows where all these countries were possible to do face-to-face surveys. And we would very much like, maybe Xenia can organize a second joint webinar on the crisis of democracies in a post-pandemic world. With these two phenomena that we see in Asia, we see in Latin America, which is authoritarian democracies like Bolsonaro, Salvador, etc., Nicaragua, and competitive authoritarianism in Southeast Asia. I think we may be at the light of disguised democracies, you know, and people are not being able to distinguish between a real democracy and a disguised democracy with all these very complex and blurred elements that appear to be, but are not really. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much, Marta. Latina Barometer under your leadership is doing a truly fascinating work. And I invite all our participants of the webinar today to visit the website of our Latina Barometer and explore all the wonderful and amazing data and publications that you can find there. With this, we will now move to our last speaker of today, Michael Robbins, who is the director of the sixth barometer, the Arab Barometer. Michael is a research fellow at Princeton University and also affiliated the Center for Political Studies at the University of Michigan. Michael has led and overseen more than 50 surveys in international contexts, and he's a leading expert in survey methods to prevent the data fabrication. Michael, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ksenia. All right. So we're very glad to have this opportunity to share with you what we've been doing over the past year with the Arab Barometer. Obviously, as it has for all the different barometers, it's been a significant challenge to figure out how to continue collecting the most reliable survey data that we can during this period. To give you a sense, a lot of the goals of the barometer, the Arab Barometer in this case, are to track the attitudes, but also to think about building institutional capacity in the region to do surveys in different modes. And so we initially, when this pandemic first struck, Princeton actually stopped us from doing face-to-face survey research and indicated that the IRB required us to move in other ways. So that's how we approached the pandemic. So we've done 5 waves before that are all face-to-face, but in the 6th wave, we've actually moved to phone surveys. And I'll talk a bit more about the methodology here. What we have done is to, again, to do phone surveys in a number of countries across the region. So far, we've completed them in Algeria, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, and Tunisia. And we're doing 4 rounds of surveys, since obviously the length of the survey has to be so much shorter. We're doing 4 different waves to try and include the range of questions that we typically have. We're hoping to complete these in a number of additional countries now, Iraq, Kuwait, and Libya, and hopefully we'll have data from them soon. So basically what we've done is use a random digit dial of 1,000 respondents per country, more or less, for each of the 4 different surveys that we're doing across this 6th wave. With the exception of Lebanon, where we've actually used a recontact sample based on a list of 350,000 phone numbers that our local partner maintains. And in all cases, we're working with local partners across the region, trying to increase the capacity to do phone surveys, given that we've always typically done face-to-face, and are working with them to develop the techniques necessary to carry out the phone surveys. So to talk a bit about the methodological challenges we faced as we headed into this, the first was really the question of mode. So since we couldn't do face-to-face, or at the time at least it was seen as impossible with the IRB restrictions, we considered phone versus web. What we ultimately decided was phone surveys. As we investigated the web surveys, the opt-in panels, or other options, it didn't seem viable to create a nationally representative sample, or we were worried about some of the biases. So not to say that these couldn't be viable, but it is what we started off with as we moved away from face-to-face, was to focus on phone surveys. The second challenge we faced was the institutional capacity of our different partners across the region. Some used auto dial, some used random digit dial based on phone numbers that could be provided. Others were using callbacks. And so we went through the methodologies of each, looked at the number of numbers that they either had on had collected from previous surveys. In the case of Lebanon, roughly a third of the numbers of households across the entire country. In other cases, only a few thousand. And so we tried to make a best decision about how to do this. Another thing that we tried to do is make minor modifications. This was the first time as a project we were doing phone surveys. So, given that we were trying to learn more about this mode as we approached the wave, we wanted to make essentially not necessarily massive modifications. So for instance, we did a few things such as a case management system, integrated that into the survey to a greater extent than a lot of our partners had been doing previously. And then second, we introduced stratification by carrier. So in some cases, carriers are affiliated with, either are stronger in certain areas, or that they, may be linked with certain types of identities or other things that could be, potentially biasing if we didn't, stratify by the phone carrier. So we did that. We also faced a challenge with the sampling frame for essentially a single or a dual. So in this case, we could either do a landline, a mobile only sample, or a combination of both. In most of the countries where we're doing the survey, we had a penetration of mobile numbers in excess of 90%. So we opted for a mobile only sample. This is some other potential challenges with the inability with the way that there aren't area codes like there are in, say, the US or Canada that are assigned to a geography. So it made it more difficult to stratify by governorate or other, other key geographic areas like we might have wanted to and could have done with a landline. But given that the greater penetration of mobile numbers, we decided to stick with the mobile only for this survey. The length of the interview, as I mentioned before, was also a challenge. We are trying to limit this to at most 20 minutes, which is already fairly long for a phone survey. Given that our face-to-face typically lasts about 45 minutes, we need demographics in each of the surveys. We had to break this up into 4 separate surveys. So typically we do 2,400, per country face-to-face. And in this case, we're doing about 1,000 respondents, over time, starting in July and lasting until December, January. We also faced a challenge with the infrastructure in each country. That mobile networks are stronger in, say, the capital than they are in outlying areas. However, we were able to, our sense was based on, the experience of our partners, we would get surveys that were carried out in, more rural, more distant areas as well. So this isn't necessarily the ideal. We could have potentially approached other methods, but we decided to try and solve this through weighting. We also have non-response bias, and this is something that particularly comparing the countries and the results across countries is a significant concern for us, that we have differing response rates per country. In some cases, if we're doing an auto dial where there may be a delay before the respondent picks up versus, someone who's dialing a number directly, potentially coming from, in one case, the main university in the country versus in other cases, a market research firm, that we have differing response rates that come up here. This isn't something that we decided to tackle initially. We wanted to get the data back, look at this, and think about this for future research. We also are facing what we perceive as mode effects. We're trying to think about how to make the phone surveys match as close as we can, or at least be calibrated to match the face-to-face we've done in the past. In part, we designed the questionnaire around this to think about different questions that we thought would potentially have different mode effects, whether that be, not having an interviewer who's in person, and potentially some of the biases that may result from that in part, but also the different effects that might come from, fear of potentially, being on the phone, differences in the samples. And again, we're getting the data back now and haven't processed this entirely, but are trying to think about ways to conduct future research to really isolate what are the mode effects and how we can potentially think about, calibrating the results to compare with some of the face-to-face we've done in the past. And finally, in the Middle East and North Africa, a significant challenge is regime type. We have countries that are largely, kind of free and fair, that people aren't scared of the government, such as Tunisia. In other countries, it's a bit less democratic. And so in this case, there may be a response bias, particularly thinking about who's on the other line. Is it actually a researcher? Is this somebody from the government or, from the authorities, something like that? And so it is something that we're again thinking about trying to condition this and look at future research. So with this being our first step into phone surveys, we wanted to, in some sense, collect the data, see what we had, and then plan. And as we continue along this wave and likely, doing more phone surveys in the future, think about how we can actually gain more leverage on these questions so we can hopefully have a way that, in a either a pandemic or if other, issues on the ground limit our ability face-to-face, trying to develop other modes across the region that can be, more viable. And potentially we could compare and think about the differences that we're seeing, based on other modes and how that may how public opinion may be changing in response to ongoing events. So what we're actually planning as we're going forward throughout this wave is additional phone surveys. We're thinking about conducting at the same time an online opt-in panel to think about what potential biases that we see or how viable this may be. We're also planning a push to web by text message. So trying to, get respondents to respond to an online survey by texting them at random, and also conducting in some places, we've have, conditional approval from IRB now to do some face-to-face surveys to really think about mode effects. So in a large way, this survey, this wave for us is not only, trying to document public opinion, but really increase the capacity to do public opinion across the region. So in that sense, it's been very exciting to have this opportunity to explore some of these other methods that we haven't tried before. So with that, I wanted to present some of the results from the 5 countries that we have completed by phone and think about what we may be seeing here and kind of the effects of COVID on the region. So the first, in thinking about how we ask about things like COVID, is we ask citizens, what is the most important challenge facing your country, with one of the options being coronavirus. In the past, we've always seen that economic conditions and corruption tend to be the 2 most prominent, but we see wide variation here across the region, from about half in Morocco and Algeria saying COVID's the predominant concern, to only about 1 in 10 in Lebanon saying the same. However, if we flip this question about the concern of COVID spreading, it's that Lebanon's actually the country where there's greatest concern here. 82% say that they're concerned about this. And so again, this is one of the challenges about asking most pressing problems. Lebanon has been through essentially a currency collapse, a banking crisis, the port explosion, the devastated Beirut. And so obviously COVID is a central issue, but it isn't necessarily the central issue to most Lebanese. So again, thinking about how we calibrate certain questions here and thinking about the country context to understand the importance of COVID to people and their level of concern. And certainly as we go down, there is a high level of concern across all countries about COVID spreading. Some of these surveys are actually, from back in July. So in a case like Tunisia, where COVID's increased significantly, or the caseload has increased significantly in recent months, there have been significant changes, and I'll show that in a moment. We also are thinking about the reasons for concern, trying to isolate what are people worried about and how might the government, address this. And so one of the things that we're seeing is that, in most of the countries, about a third say that their main reason for concern about COVID spreading is that a family member may get ill or die. So it is something very personal, essentially stopping the pandemic. In Lebanon, this is significantly higher, 67%, but in other countries, it's about a third. And another one that we see, and the second most common reason we see across the region, is that there's a concern that citizens aren't following the recommendations or taking them seriously to try and stop the spread of COVID. So again, about a third hold this view. What surprised us was that the capacity of the healthcare system and its inability to handle the crisis was not actually a higher level of concern. But again, these are the 2 ways that citizens are processing this. So as governments try and address this across the region, these would be 2 of the key elements to potentially work on, to try and help, assure citizens that this crisis is at least, more under control. The government's taking serious steps. However, again, we can see that, kind of reflecting on what Minhua showed in Singapore, we're seeing something similar in Tunisia, perhaps. So here we ask about the concern about COVID spreading. So we have a survey from July and a survey from October. And in this case, the percent who's saying they're very concerned about COVID has increased from 23% to 44% during this short period. And that somewhat reflects the change in the increase in the spread of COVID across the region, across Tunisia. The percent saying they're unconcerned has fallen from 40% to 20%, and the somewhat concerned has remained more or less constant at 36% in the first wave and 35%. So again, we see significant changes, and I think that's one of the most difficult things about surveying during this period, is that there is a huge amount of change, perhaps in views of COVID, views of the government, its effectiveness, and other elements. So there is a real temporal aspect here that we're seeing across most of the countries where we've completed 2 surveys to date. We also are seeing differences in the reasons for concern. So in Tunisia, the the increase in likelihood of a death of a member or a family member or an illness has increased by 14 points. Again, the healthcare system can't handle this, has increased by 12 points during this period, while citizens not following recommendations has decreased somewhat. So again, what we're seeing here is rapidly changing public opinion about the effects of COVID in Tunisia over a very short time period. One of the other things that we're seeing consistently across the region is that women are significantly more concerned about the spread of COVID and the effects of COVID than are men. And so this does seem to be a gendered story. We've seen this across a number of other countries where we have survey data during this period, but women are perhaps more affected by this than men, or at least, they feel more affected about this crisis than men. So overall, when we ask what's the most important challenge in your country, and essentially all the countries, and in Lebanon it's very low, but in the other countries we have a significant difference, typically of 10 or more points between men and women on this question. And the same is true about the extent of COVID spreading in the next 6 months. Again, we see women being simply more concerned by 10 points or more in most cases, even again in this case in Lebanon. So women are particularly concerned. A lot of this, and we saw this as well in Minhua's presentation, the fear of losing income. The effects of COVID, even if the effects of COVID are significant, and over half in all the countries that we surveyed, including 90% in Lebanon, say that they are, very or somewhat concerned about losing their main source of income. And again, there is somewhat of a gendered aspect to this, that women are more concerned than men in most countries about losing their source of income. So again, women are being hit particularly hard, not only, perhaps directly, but also psychologically about, the challenges that come from COVID. Then we also ask a question about perceptions. This isn't saying that there has been an incidence of gender-based violence or GBV during this period, but a perception that it's likely to have increased as a result of COVID. So perhaps, women being forced to stay home with men who are abusive, things like that. And we've seen across the region, there is significant concern about this issue, that 70% in Tunisia say there's a perception it's increased, about not quite half in Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, and about a third in Lebanon. And again, women are more likely to say that there is a sense that this has increased, that GBV is likely to have increased as a result of the pandemic. So as governments work to solve this crisis, really focusing on the gender aspect would be an important element of the response. Another thing that we're thinking about is, what are the effects of COVID on government? How is government viewed as a result of the COVID pandemic? And so here we have levels of trust in government, and we can see is a fairly high correspondence in a number of countries between trust in the government itself, the prime minister and the government, and the more technocratic aspect, which is the reporting of the statistics on COVID itself. So in this case, in a case like Morocco, in Jordan and Morocco, we see that over half are saying that they trust the government on the survey, and again, over half are saying that they also trust the government statistics. In a case like Algeria, 46% say they trust the government, and again, a correspondence with the reporting of statistics, 46%. And even in Tunisia, in Lebanon, where trust is low, there's a higher level of trust in government statistics on COVID. And in part, we're seeing here, which may be a mode effect, and so I don't want to read too much into it, but again, we're seeing a higher level of trust in government than we've potentially seen in the past, and perhaps that may be linked with their response on COVID. That certainly comes up as well, and I think is even stronger here when we look at the satisfaction with government performance overall and the evaluation of COVID. So in the case of Jordan, we see 78% are satisfied in the survey. This was done back a couple of months ago with the government's overall performance. 78% are satisfied with the overall performance, 75% with the government's response to COVID. In Morocco, 76% are satisfied to 74% on COVID. And so in Algeria, 66% and 65%. So these really seem to correspond fairly strongly. And in a case like Tunisia, where this is a higher level of satisfaction than we've seen on face-to-face before, and the survey here matches up fairly closely overall with the previous face-to-face on a number of the indicators, we see that, in a sense, that the performance of the government may be increasing as a result of its performance on COVID, which is significantly higher. In Lebanon, despite the dire performance of the government, which has led to many protests, certainly the performance on COVID is higher. So there seems to be a link in a number of countries between these two, and potentially people now evaluating the performance on COVID. And in most countries that we've surveyed, if we compare the performance on COVID to performance on education or just health in general, we do see that the performance of government overall is more linked with its response to COVID than its management of these other factors. So again, there seems to be a change in how people are viewing their government, perhaps linked with its response to COVID. And finally, thinking about kind of how citizens are responding and what governments may do, particularly given the concern that citizens aren't necessarily following the recommendations of the government or health authorities about COVID. We ask about curtailing civil liberties during a public health emergency like COVID. And we see typically across the region, minorities are saying that it is acceptable to take away civil rights during this period. In Algeria, for instance, a third or fewer, they've just had a major uprising. So it doesn't seem that that Algerians are willing to give their rights. The same in Lebanon. And in Tunisia, the results are somewhat similar. So they don't want freedom of speech taken away, censoring the media, limiting freedom of movement, or tracking and tracing citizens' locations. In other countries, such as Jordan, a number of these are a bit higher, but overall, the general picture here is that a minority say that it's always acceptable for the government to take these actions. So in some sense, the governments are a bit limited in potentially what citizens are willing to accept from them to try and limit this. So with that, let me conclude.
Thank you so much, Michael. It has been truly fascinating. All those solutions which our barometer has found, how to overcome the effects of pandemic, and maybe our colleagues in the audience and from other barometers can pick up some of your ideas to apply in other regions. We are now slowly proceeding to the questions and answer session. I invite all the attendees to write your questions in the chat using the chat function. Depending on time, we might be able also to take 3 to 4 questions live. So if you have some comments or some remark that you would like to share with us, please raise your hand and we might invite several, maybe not unfortunately all of you, but 3 or 4 people will be given a possibility to speak. While you're preparing the questions, I would like to give the floor to my colleague, co-moderator Yunhan, for his remarks and maybe first questions to the speakers. Yunhan, please.
Yes. Really, we have just listening to 6 fascinating and truly illuminating presentation from different angles. And personally, I have learned so much. For instance, that I believe that Afrobarometer have up to this point have done the most. Try to follow and monitor the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm sure that we will learn a great deal from the experience that you have accumulated. And also, I think for Asian Barometer, we have just decided to move up our next wave. Originally, it was scheduled for 2022, but now we want to move up to next year, so that it will be in time. Still probably next year we'll be still in the middle of this public health crisis, and we can actually apply many COVID-19 related questions so that we can have a better grasp, of all the social, political, psychological consequences of this pandemic. And just one specific methodological footnote I would like to share with you, that one of our team, which is wrapping up their fieldwork right now in Hong Kong. Hong Kong, as we know, that is also is badly hit by the pandemic, and also it's one of the most densely populated society of the world, and so due to the lockdown, and also people are afraid of close contact with strangers, so it become very difficult to do face-to-face survey. But nevertheless, our Hong Kong colleague, they actually take advantage of the fact that Hong Kong have the highest penetration rate of internet connection. Okay, probably 97% of households, they are connected. And also the fact that nowadays, people across different generations, they got used to video conferences. So even people who haven't used that before, but now, for all the practical reasons, they got to learn how to use Zoom or other online video conferences. So actually, what they try to do is they use a phone, the random digital dialing first, and locate the targeted respondent. And they do a telephone survey first, but only for like 15 minutes. But then they provide them additional incentive, some material incentive to persuade them, to set up another appointment, so that they will, take part in this a few days down the road. So in the end, they are able to combine much more brief telephone survey first, but then a few years later, they can conduct a much longer face-to-face interview in the cyberspace, which is just as good as the real in-person face-to-face. Although I know this practice may not be readily transportable to many other regions, due to the constraint of the internet penetration rate. But nevertheless, I do think this is the looking down the road. This could be another interesting experiment. How to combine the conventional approach with this innovative approach. So with that, I leave it, and now we can move on to the Q&A. Sinia, would you like to identify a few questions first, and then we will invite our speaker, how they want to respond. Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Yunhan. I don't see any raised hands, so apparently there are nobody willing to speak live at the moment. Thus, we will turn to the questions which have been sent to us in chat. There is one hand. Let me read you a couple of questions we received in chat, and then the WAPOR past president Claire Durant will have a word. So we received the questions about the survey methodology in India, that it have been predominantly as seen from pictures and paper, and whether there were any challenges with using copy, in particular copy offline. Another question was also about India, about tracking the location of the interviewers, because many villages have the same name in India, and there are some cases of data fabrication. So maybe our colleagues in India can comment on this. There was a question about Eurasia, about population registers, but I think Christina has already answered that in chat. Then we had a question about the capacity for conducting telephone surveys in the Middle East, that the databases of numbers are not that extensive. Maybe we can have some comments on this from the colleagues from Africa and the Middle East. There was a question about measuring trust in science, and there was a question about measuring trust in the new vaccines developed against corona. Then we had a question, apart from Arab and Eurasia, did other barometers consider it a temporary shift from face-to-face to phone or online till the pandemic lasts? So these are the questions that we received so far. One more question was also about the problems with coverage, that when we switch to a phone service or online service, that the coverage of the population with telephones might, in some countries, might be relatively low, and how these have been solved in terms of the sample qualities. And one question arrived just now, if somebody from our colleagues can speak a bit more in details about the specific measures that we used in surveys regarding governance related to COVID-19. This is the question.
Would you like me to start from India?
These are the questions which we received so far. And I now turn over to Yun Han, who will moderate our answers. Again, I don't see any raised hands, so I think we can start with the first round of answers.
I think quite a few questions.
Yun Han, I think Claire had the hand up.
Yeah, go ahead, Martha. Yeah, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Just saying that Claire Durand, former president of WAPOR, had her hand up.
Yes, that's correct. But at the moment, yes, now I can hear. Now it's raised again.
No, my question, I had put my question in the chat, so it's okay. So I lower my hand.
Yes, Claire, please. Yeah, go. Please, the floor is yours, Claire.
No, Ksenia just thought about my question. I had put it in the chat also, and it was about trust in science. Whether people measured trust in science.
Okay, trust in science. It's a question for Donald Trump, I suppose. No, I'm
and others.
Yeah.
Very good.
Okay. Maybe I will invite Sandeep, to speak for. I think quite a few questions, being related to the situation in India or South Asia specifically. For instance, that the mode of interview, that whether you have tried computer assistance, computer assisted interview, or what would be the pro and con in your continental context. Yeah. Sandeep?
Thank you, Yunan. I think there have been 4 sets of questions, and I'll quickly answer all of them. First, entire South Asia region has been a little diffident of using any method of survey other than a face-to-face interview. We have been a little diffident of using online method or telephone method, simply because we are not yet fully convinced that by using that method, we would be able to get a authentically representative sample. So all these surveys, even after the start of the pandemic that we have done, are surveys which are face-to-face interviews. We have made sure that our respondents take our field investigators take adequate precautions when they go into the field. That is part of the training. And we make sure that they keep themselves safe and also keep their respondents safe. So all the 3 studies I talked about, all the 3 surveys I talked about, were surveys which were done face-to-face, using maintaining all the protocols which the pandemic required. Point number 2, among the 3 studies we did during the pandemic, in one of them, that is the election-related survey, we decided to use the mobile app for both the pre-poll survey and the post-poll survey. We decided to use the mobile app. We used it there for 2 particular reasons. Number 1, because this survey was limited to a particular state, it was easier to do it digitally in a state. And number 2, because both our pre-poll survey and post-poll survey were connected to the media, were connected to the television, we required a quick transmission of the data, and therefore we used the mobile app in order to do the survey so that the transmission of the data happened much faster. And we found that using the mobile app, we were able to do a survey which was of a much higher quality in terms of the data. The data was of a much higher quality is what we found. Point number 3, I would be a little cautious in assuming that Data fabrication is a typical problem in South Asia. I would not accept that at all. I think the level of data fabrication we deal with or we face or we encounter is exactly the same level of data fabrication you would find in other parts of the world. And we have more than enough checks in place to ensure that if our field investigators were not being honest in terms of the survey, we are able to detect it. We go in for random checks, we go in for calling up the select respondents because the questionnaire has the mobile number. So I would believe that data fabrication in South Asia is as much a problem as it is in the rest of the world, and it's not a peculiar problem to us, or is not a heightened problem for us. And finally, yes, there are places with similar names. We specify the spaces where the interview will happen looking at the voters list. So even if there is a similarity of names, there are different numbers allotted either to the assembly segment or to the polling station, and therefore we are able to track which polling station the interview is happening in, and therefore a similarity of names does not really make an impact in that sense. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sandeep. Eventually, I will invite every speaker to offer their kind of closing remark at some point. But I just got, I guess, a very interesting question from Barry Guinea. So I just want to throw this to any one of you, especially Michael, perhaps, that did you find any difference in terms of perception between rural and urban citizens in terms of COVID-19 impact on their living condition? I think this also has a lot to do with what Boniface mentioned earlier, that Afrobarometer tried to build up index of vulnerability. Apparently, the circumstances rural people and urban people found themselves in would be quite different. Although this difference also will vary from one content to another. Michael, do you have any comment on this? Or yeah,
sure. That's a great question, and in a way, the societies in the Middle East and North Africa don't necessarily have, and historically haven't seen, the divisions between urban and rural quite to the extent that we might think we would. Part of that is, I think that populations tend to be concentrated. Even the rural areas aren't that necessarily far from an urban center, so it's somewhat different, I think, than India in most cases. That's not always the case. In this case, what we've really seen are the major differences by gender. It's not necessarily as large by urban rural, but we also, to be honest, have some challenges with thinking about what is urban and rural, because in this case, because it is a phone survey, it is self-defined. So we're actually doing additional research into thinking about how accurate are people, can we try and place them. And so one of the things we want to do is kind of match how rural or urban is this area, and think about that and kind of the variations, because we are asking more detailed, about a district or the name of the district. And so we haven't finished that analysis yet, which I think would be necessary, because normally, we in the face-to-face, we stratify by urban rural and actually can have more confidence in those measures, at least by the local definition of that. So it isn't something that we've seen a strong correlation yet to date. But we want to do more on this, because a number of people in their surveys say they're not sure how to classify their area. They're not necessarily in a big city, but they're not necessarily in what they would think of as a rural area. So there is actually some definitional issues here that we're facing. And we would want to think about that more if we could actually, think about that before I could, really say that there is a clear urban-rural divide.
There's another issue, I think, keep popping up. I do think, this could be a very interesting organizing concept for a lot of COVID-19 related questions. That is the trust, the issue of trust. Apparently, the trust in the government or trust in the state apparatus, matter a lot, and it matters in terms, whether they can convince the citizen, to really follow the guideline, on facial masks and things like that, more spontaneously and without too much resistance, or whether they are willing to give the authority the power to monitor their whereabout, through the smartphone and satellite, the information, if they truly trust, their proper authority, without worry that their privacy have been unnecessarily infringed upon. And also we listen to other related issues about trusting expert, trusting science, and sooner or later, trust in the safety of vaccine. So I do think this would be a very truly the very useful organizing concept. So I want to pose this question to Martha, because Martha, you offer quite I have to say, a very disparaging, observation about, how badly your region has been hit, by pandemic, and to what extent has anything to do with, absence of trust, or does that, play a role, in making sense, what's going on in your region, Martha?
Thank you, Yunhan. I think this is a very salient and maybe one of the most important issues. Well, Latin America is, as we know by the Global Barometer indicators, the region of the world that has the less trust in institutions and in people. Interpersonal trust and trust in institutions is at the bottom here when compared to all the 6 regions we have. No doubt that this lack of trust has been very significant in the building up of this discontent towards politics that had been growing through I would say, the last decade, since 2010, with increasing insatisfaction of citizens towards their way the democracy was working in their countries. And I think this is where the divide starts. On the one side, people have distrust in government and distrust in institutions, but on the other side, there is a tremendous demand for access to rights, for equality before the law, for all those elements that constitute the core of democracy. So the trust is not towards I would say, the building of the institution, but with the people that inhabit the institutions. And I think that distinction comes very clear when you see what happens with this thing between truth and false that we have seen in Brazil, but not only in Brazil, also in other countries, where the president's approval is enormously high at the moment where the most amount of people are dying in that particular country. So it's all about what you make people believe. And this is what's happening in the United States. I mean, 73 million Americans voted for Trump. Although, one might say he was lying about many issues, okay? So what is truth and what is false? And what do people believe? And we also have in Europe these huge protests of people saying they don't want any measures and they don't believe in the virus, and the virus is just an invention in order to restrain civil liberties, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that this is another phenomena that comes out of these multiple crises, is that somehow those very, I would say, permanent truths that were absolutely uncontested before the pandemic are now not so. And so it is possible to say something that is completely untrue, and you would get people believing that that issue that is untrue. So, the whole thing of the pandemic and how you faced it and how you culturally adhere to it and how effective quarantines are. This is the case of Argentina. I mean, Argentina has the longest quarantine in the world, but it doesn't work. Everybody's in the street. Nobody abides by the quarantine because they don't believe it. So, trust is one part, but truth is another. You have true and false. This is a new, I would say, cleavage that goes into media, goes into communication, political communication, social communication, and it would be fascinating to see how this intervenes in the evolution of trust that we have been able to observe before. So, yes, I think that this is one of the things we need to measure. This trust and approval that is contradictory with the events. And the same Bolsonaro has had enormous approval rates in the middle of his amazing statements that saying, well, people are coward, they have to die. I mean, this has nothing to do with me. I can't do anything about it. I mean, this is pandemic, don't ask me.
Okay, thank you, Martha. Now, well, first of all, my quick comment. Yes?
Sorry, I just wanted to ask Michael something that, after your presentation, it got me thinking. The reason why we decided not to do telephone polling in Latin America is because precisely that population, which is the most vulnerable, the poor, and the ones who are going to lose the more, are the least represented in telephone surveys. So we had a gap of about 20% in each country, which were the poorest, that we would not be able to reach by phone. And the question is, do you have a good map of those who have you not been able to reach by phone in those countries? And what is the social economic composition, socio-demographic composition of those?
So it's one of the things we're doing. We've gotten back from the field now and are really trying to think more. We have data, thinking through what are the differences. So we do see, as is typical in phone surveys, those who are better educated, who are wealthier, tend to be more likely to respond to a phone survey. Those are known challenges with the sample there. So it has been a challenge. One of the things we'd like to do is field phone and face-to-face at the same time. And we have some designs that would help us get leverage on that. I think the challenge for us is that, that given the situation across the region, that at times face-to-face isn't going to be viable. And, one of my great regrets is that we just fielded a face-to-face survey in Algeria about 4 days before the revolution there broke out, the Harak, and we didn't have a way to go back in the, face-to-face. And we'd love to try to do something with phone, even if there are differences, even if it's not perfect, we would have been able to field a phone. And so trying to actually think about how we can measure public opinion. And one of the interesting effects we see in another sense is that even if we've kind of matched things up, we're actually seeing in some countries smaller, we're seeing more conservative attitudes on gender on the phone, even with a more educated population. And that may be a reducing, interviewer effects on having female interviewers, and people are scared to say face-to-face. So in a way, I think what we've decided as a project is not to necessarily say that these, we don't want to say these surveys are perfect. There may be biases. We know that there are probably biases, like you've said. Really think about how can we leverage them to best collect the accurate public opinion data at different times and different scenarios. And so, really think about this as not, these surveys are the final piece of this, but really kind of a process to think about how can we calibrate that? How can we actually take into account the differences in samples, and maybe try and calibrate those to, at least reflect more closely when we can't do a face-to-face like right now, to do that. So we're taking this on kind of as a multi-year project to see, can we make this more viable? Because the issues that you've raised are there, and it's certainly something we need to think about as we have these data back and are starting to do. But it is going to be a long process. So you're absolutely right. I mean, I wouldn't want to say, and that's why I didn't present kind of trend lines here, or differences over time. We don't have competence to do that now. We are seeing this. Particularly what we're seeing is a variation on regime type, it seems, that in a place like Tunisia, the phone surveys look very, very much like the face-to-face. We also have typically middle-income countries that aren't necessarily, historically at least, quite as unequal, and we have mobile phone penetration rates of 90% with that basically excluding some of the older population more so than necessarily, obviously some of the poor who don't have that, but access to mobile phones isn't quite the issue in the Middle East, it may be elsewhere. So we have, 90% of the population covered is the estimate in most of the countries where we survey. And, it is thinking about what are the biases there. So it's a long process, I think, for us to kind of develop this. And hopefully if we can get more leverage by doing face-to-face, by doing these web surveys and think about how are these different, we'll be able to improve that. And again, I don't think we'll ever move away from face-to-face unless, response rates just completely plummet or they become too expensive. But we do want to increase the ability to use other modes as part of our ability to try and track public opinion. So that's really the goal of what we're doing right now.
Okay, I saw Boniface raising his hand, so I will recognize him first. And after Boniface, I will invite Minhua to offer his closing remark, and then Christian to offer his closing remark. Since we are running late, we already overstand our schedule for about 15 minutes. But nevertheless, we do want to, give each speaker a chance to offer their closing remark. Boniface, please. Yeah.
Thank you. I think from the Afrobarometer, we are looking at exploring the option of telephone surveys, but not as a substitute for the face-to-face surveys, but rather as an alternative option, especially for short surveys on emerging issues like health pandemics, as we've seen with COVID-19. Otherwise, I think the challenges that we face with the telephone surveys on the African continent, I think are similar to what our colleagues, I think, are highlighting, perhaps even worse. We have, I think, a variation in terms of mobile phone coverage by country, as well as mobile phone ownership. But we also see that there's, I think, in terms of who do we leave out if we go the telephone option. I think people with high levels of poverty, those with no formal education, as well as people over 65, almost more than 1/3 of those groups really telling us that they don't own a phone. But besides, I think the issue of access and leaving people out, I think a challenge for us as well is how to obtain the cell phone numbers. Yes, there are options to get them, but this differ from country to country. And I think some of the options that, for example, now we are exploring in Namibia are pretty costly because we have to engage sampling people from outside the continent to draw the samples for us. But even then, I think in terms of representativeness, because most of the people owning phones, or at least where cell phone coverage is good, in urban areas, as you can see already, even today, even for me, I'm in an urban context, but having challenges of connectivity. And I think these are really multiplied multiple times for people living in rural areas, which is the case for most of our citizens on the African continent. But it is an alternative that COVID-19 has really forced us to explore, and we are looking into that. Thank you.
Thank you. Minhua? Yes. Minhua, please.
Yeah, I'm going to add 2 points. I execute a lot of field work, right? And in Asia, we cover a lot of authoritarian regimes. So although COVID made us very excited regarding how we can approach all those impacts, and we will get a lot of new things and information, etc. But execution-wise, when COVID broke out, the state actually becomes even stronger, especially in emergency periods. The social conformity in Asian people really surge high. So in that regard, in some of the countries that we operate our survey, usually originally team up with NGO or using certain, space, have some kind of liberty that we can operate in the field. But right now, that kind of room probably will disappear. So that is one of the nightmares that in my mind, for example, in China, in Myanmar, in maybe Cambodia, in other places, really the authoritarian become even stronger. And it comes with the second worry. If we being able to find some, organization affiliated with the state, we might get through, but the result of the survey might kind of biased because the government doesn't want to hear bad news or criticism from the public opinion dissatisfaction. That will compromise the integrity of the survey result. But if we've been able to find some independent NGO or something that not affiliated with the government operating in those authoritarian countries, then we will put that in danger in some ways. So that is something that kind of flashing in my mind that I'm really worried about doing survey under the COVID periods. Of course, we can do it web. We can go doing different modes and to see whether we can alleviate this kind of problem. But those two issues always linger in my mind when I go into, for example, we're going to kick off our survey in Cambodia next month, and we're operating with our collaborator actually affiliation with the government. So I need to see how they will respond and how they will cope with all these issues. And I always need to keep in mind that there will be a chances that such kind of a government affiliate organization try to please the government or under the restriction of government, that the result might be compromised. So I got to be vigilant about that. Okay, so I'll stop here.
Okay, Christian.
Thank you, Johan. If you look at the development in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia, we have two waves. The first wave is finished. Then there was this slowdown over summer, now the second wave. What we find out in Central Eastern Europe and Central Asia is that in wave one, we had approval rates of the government of about 70%. So we had the rise of government, the rise of national unity, dominance of executive. And the other powers, the legal system, the parliaments declined. So there was this cause for national unity to rally behind Angela Merkel, to rally behind the Austrian Chancellor, to rally behind the President of Slovakia and so on. So this, the wave one was the time of government. Nobody was challenging this. Is also what Mino was saying. In these times, you want to rally behind the government. You don't want to criticize the government too much because it's an emergency. Now the second wave is here. These approval rates of these governments go down from 70 to 50%. So what we have now is more and more people say, we don't want to run after this president because there are some mistakes which we don't agree with. So you have more dissent. We have now, in the second wave, the return of parliament, the return of legal systems, constitutional court saying your measures have been against the constitution. So the second and third power, the parliament, the legal system is now fighting back. And the government is losing this monopoly of emergency, being wonderful and the best. And now all other parties, before there was the party alliance. All parties say, no, it's emergency, we have to support the government. Now, in Germany, in Austria, in Slovakia, in Georgia, the parties are saying, no, we don't go with that. And of course, we have also the people who are demonstrating against this measure. So what we found out in the wave one, we have the rise of the government. Now, the government goes back to almost normal, still high to high, 50%. But the parliaments are saying, stop, we don't want to wash away all our democratic freedoms under the symbol of COVID. And also the courts come back. You cannot just impose any curfew because you want to do it as a government. You have to check and balance with the legal system and the parliament. So we have a different response to wave one to wave two. And we are now moving back, not to normality yet, but back from this feeling it's an emergency, we have to rally behind the president and the prime minister now. We have more pluralism, we have more dissent, at least in democracies. In the autocratic regimes, things are different, as you all know. This would be our conclusion, and we will check it in our next survey, how far we got in the second wave. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian. Now I'm going to hand over the podium to my co-moderator, Senior, who's going to wrap up this webinar. Yeah, please, Senior.
Thank you so much, Yunhan. I would like to thank all panelists today for their absolutely excellent presentations, very insightful. I think we all took really a lot from today's webinar. I would like to thank all our colleagues in the audience for attending and for asking very interesting, sometimes provocative questions. It has been an excellent experience for all of us, and we wish the best of luck to the Global Barometer survey with the ongoing in the next round, and hopefully the new emerging solutions will allow for the surveys to carry on despite the challenges that we experience. I would like to remind all of our participants today that the video record of today's webinar will be available at the WAPOR website, and also the presentations of all speakers will be also available at the WAPOR website in the section with webinars. Please follow WAPOR on Facebook and Twitter. We post regularly announcements about our activities, and we'll be publishing also there the program of our next webinars. So we have a plan for the new series of webinars for the next year, and our website and our social media challenge will be a perfect source of information about this. Once again, thank you very much for your attendance. And Yunhan, would you like to add some very final note?
Obviously, I also want to echo Senior that, I really want to express my heartfelt gratitude to our speaker, but also I want to acknowledge, recognize that, Senior, she has put in so many energy and time in making this possible. So I also I want to thank her, for her wonderful work, behind the curtain. And also, obviously, we will follow up on Martha's wonderful suggestion that we should, in the near future, open another webinar on the crisis of democracy in the post-pandemic era, and probably also in the post-truth era. So with that, I leave it. And so it's getting very late in Taipei. So I would say good night or good day, depending on where you are. And see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye. Bye-bye. Yeah, bye-bye. Bye-bye. Okay. Signing off. Yeah, signing off.